Hi, everyone. Jonathan Alexander here with the Los Angeles Review of Books, and it is my real pleasure to have Malinda Lo, one of the nation's most important writers for young adults, and someone who came to real stardom with a novel from 2010 or so, Ash, which is sort of an updated Cinderella lesbian story, and it quickly became a classic YA novel dealing with issues of gender and sexuality. We're here today to talk about Malinda's new book, Last Night at the Telegraph Club. Malinda, thank you for chatting with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I always like to ask, how did you come to write about this book? And we should let people know without giving any spoilers, this is a really interesting historical YA about a young Chinese woman, Chinese American woman who's 17, kind of coming into her own sense of herself as a lesbian during the 1950s. And the book beautifully kind of gives readers a sense of the history and what it would have been like to live in the US, in San Francisco in the 1950s. So assuming that this is not your story, how did you come to write this story of Lily? So,
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. This book is an interesting thing because I did not think it was going to be a novel at first. I actually wrote it as a short story for an anthology of queer YA historical fiction. And I was inspired by reading two nonfiction books for a different project that I have not yet gotten to. I was reading Wide Open Town, which is an academic history of queer San Francisco. And I was reading a popular history called Rise of the Rocket Girls, which is about the women computers at the Jet Propulsion Lab in the 1940s and 50s. So in my head, these two books, which I was reading, kind of came together, and the character of Lily emerged from that. I don't really know how the creative imagination works, but it made sense to me. So Lily is as you said, a Chinese American girl in San Francisco, and she's obsessed with rocket science. So she really wants to be like her Judy, who is a computer at the Jet Propulsion Lab. So that's where it started as a short story. And then I always have to give credit to my agent, Michael Barrett, who read the story, who was talking to me about the story and basically said, this could be a novel. And I at first did not believe him, but he convinced me. And 3 years later, it became a novel.
no, that's a great story. I love hearing about how writers come to the work that they're doing. So I think what's particularly interesting about it, and I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about what you think the role of historical YA is for, especially for young readers, because this book really gives, I think, a finely nuanced portrait of some of the difficulties that young Chinese Americans would have encountered in the 1950s US, including some really interesting kind of historical politics around people being monitored. At one point, Lily's dad is being monitored for possible connections to or help for people who might have connections to the Communist Party in China. So there's already a thick history that many young American readers might not know about. And then layered into that is also the sexual politics and Lily coming to an awareness of her own lesbianism and thinking about how that's going to complicate matters for her. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you imagine as the role of historical YA around these issues is for young readers.
I'm not sure if I can speak to that so much as I can tell you what it means to me
Please.
as a reader. And I think that I have often read historical fiction as I'm really interested in history. I love to see how storytellers imagine the past, and as a writer, I'm also a recovering academic, so I love research, And those two things come together for me in telling a story like Last Night at the Telegraph Club. I'm just fascinated to learn about all these things. Like you mentioned, young people today might not know this history, but I think middle-aged people and older people might not know this history either, because it's simply not taught in schools, Asian American history or queer history. So I know that some readers will go into it and emerge with new knowledge, and that's really great. But for me as a storyteller, the primary thing I'm trying to do is to engage them in a story about people and relationships. And, you know, I've written in many different genres. So I've done that in fantasy and science fiction. And I actually see historical fiction as very closely related to fantasy and science fiction.
Mhm.
So, you know, you're still building a world. The difference is you can look up where things were in historical fiction. And I'm not sure if that answered your question or not. I know that there's a lot of discussion within YA about the meaning of historical fiction and what kind of history can be shared with young people. But I feel that as a writer, I really need to kind of separate myself from those pedagogical goals because my artistic goals may or may not align. And I have to kind of honor that artistic goal first.
No, totally makes sense. You know, it's interesting because when I first started reading the book, I wondered if this was autobiographical in some
I'm
way.
not that old.
Yeah, well, and that's what I figured. That's what I figured. You know, I was, no, this can't possibly be. Or if maybe this was about a relative of yours or not. And regardless of whether it is or not, um, what I really liked about the book really is the character of Aunt Judy, who helps
Yeah.
Lily. And you know, what's wonderful about your portrayal of Lily's sort of, you know, kind of coming to terms, you know, kind of secretly going out with Kath to the Telegraph Club in the middle of the night, and then of course it inevitably becomes, she's exposed. It's like, wow, her parents figure out what's going on, and it's her aunt who comes to the rescue in a lot of ways. The aunt who had always
Mhm.
sort of inspired her and nurtured her interests in science and in science fiction. And I was really touched by the role of the sort of the aunt, sometimes even the uncle. And is this something that you see either in your own life or in the lives of other people?
Well, I think I wanted to give Lily an inspiration. You know, it's very hard to have dreams for the future if you have no examples ahead of you, you know? And I because she wanted to be a rocket scientist, I felt where could she get that inspiration most directly from her aunt because there were women of Judy's age doing this work at the time. And so I wanted to bring that into her life and her family is a unique family. Her father is a Stanford educated doctor who came to the US to go to medical school. His younger sister also came to the US to go to graduate school in math. And I felt that it was important for Lily's family to have a variety of responses when they find out about her, because that's realistic, you know, and not every relative is going to think the same way when they're a young person in their family comes out to them. And I just felt that Lily and Judy have that kind of mentor mentee relationship. And I just knew that Aunt Judy would not push her away. You know, she might not understand it, but she loves Lily and she wants to continue to encourage her to to pursue her dreams. So I love Aunt Judy too.
Yeah, no, she's a great character. And what's interesting also is you have some beautiful scenes where Lily and Kath are just starting to explore what their sexuality might mean, and they're very sensitively portrayed. The kind of little bit of kissing. Um, it must be difficult to write. I can only imagine.
No, I
No,
love writing
okay.
those scenes. Those are my favorite scenes to write. I
Ah, I
love
love
them.
it. I love it.
Some people hate writing
Yeah,
love scenes and sex scenes. I think it's fun. I'm really good at writing action.
yeah.
So a makeout scene is really action. Like it's not
Ah,
murder. It's not like a fantasy story,
yeah.
right? But stuff happens, which is really fun to choreograph and to describe. I love doing it.
Yeah, no, they're extremely well done, and like I said,
Thank you.
sensitive, but real. You can sense it.
Mhm.
These are two young people who are really interested and wanting to explore. So I'm curious, what other kind of research did you have to do, especially thinking about the sort of lesbian underground at the time, in kind of early 50s San Francisco, and the kind of
Well,
clubs that
there
existed.
was that one book that I read, Wide Open Town by Nan Elamilla Boyd, goes into that quite a bit. And then in order to imagine it, I am fortunate that I was a young lesbian in San Francisco in the early 2000s, and I went to a lot of lesbian bars.
Got it.
So I have experienced many of them, and I really called on those memories to write a lot of those scenes. What's interesting is when I was reading Wide Open Town, I also went to the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco to look at the archives there, because
Right.
there were additional research notes from that book in the archives.
Yeah.
And reading all those detailed interviews with informants from the 50s and 60s, I realized the dyke drama that was happening then was the same that was happening when I was in San Francisco going to the lesbian bars. So it was just so funny to think that I went to the actual descendants of those bars from the 50s and was in the community that emerged from the lesbian community in the 50s. And a lot of it was the same. It's people are the same, across time. I think. I mean, there's some differences, but I feel like in our hearts, a lot of us still want the same things. And I do think that being involved in a lesbian community
Mhm.
gave me a good insight into how to write that. I cannot imagine how I would have written it had I not gone to so many bars.
Glad that your research is paying off.
Yeah, 20 years later, my
I
research
love
has
it.
paid off. Sadly, I can't write off those drinks anymore.
Something else about the book that is I think particularly special at this cultural moment, not just for the early 50s, but for right now in 2020, there's a wealth. Well, do I say wealth? There are more and more books that are coming out, even books written for young readers, and adolescent and young adult readers, that deal with trans experience and trans
Mhm,
identification. And you have a character, Tommy Andrews, who uh, is one of the sort of attracting figures. Lily sees the
mhm.
picture of Tommy Andrews, who's a performer at the Telegraph Club, and it's one of the reasons why they go. The whole male impersonator history of that took place sometimes in that lesbian underground. But what's interesting is that you walk a very fine line.
Mhm.
Tommy is a male impersonator, but is also a lesbian, right? And so I'm really interested in your thinking about that, and how important it must be to preserve a sense of lesbian history, which I worry, even as a gay man, I worry sometimes lesbian history gets eclipsed at moments, while we are doing all sorts of other things and paying attention to other things. So with that sort of complicated nexus of stuff, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, it was very complicated. Tommy is an interesting character. I really loved writing her, and I
Yeah.
felt that if Tommy were alive now, things might be different,
Yeah.
but I had to really root Tommy in the time that she grew up in.
Right.
And in that time, that is who she was.
Yeah.
And weirdly, in the course of my research, I came across several lesbians named Tommy, which is why I named her that. And so I feel that I just really tried to be true to the character that I imagined in 1954, and that's something that I tried to do throughout the book, make sure each character was rooted in their time period. I didn't want them to feel like a 2020, person planted in 1954. I wanted them to feel like they were in that time
Right.
and
Right.
of that time.
Yeah.
So that's really how I approach Tommy, and I hope people like her. I think she's interesting and definitely very sexy, and I wanted to make sure she had that kind of persona that would draw someone in. I mean, she's a performer, so
Yeah.
she
Yeah.
has that stage presence, and I wanted that to come through in the book.
Yeah, and I loved that character. Although she's a complicated one, right? You know,
Mhm.
she seems extremely, drawn from real life. What's interesting about her, I think, and maybe this is for me part of the historical value of the book, is that you in being true to gender presentation and the complexity of it and the diversity of it at that time, you help readers understand the real historical complexity, both of lesbian representation and of emerging trans representation as well.
Mhm.
And that
Mhm.
these are intertwined stories in some ways, for a lot of people. So at the same time, as you say, it's not a 2020 book. It's a book for 2020 readers, but a book specifically about this time.
Yeah.
So in terms of things that people might read, they read this book, what should they read next?
Oh, what should they read next? Well, okay, so this book was very clearly influenced by Tipping the Velvet by Sarah Waters. If
Ah,
you have
yeah.
not read Tipping the Velvet, you should read it.
Yeah,
Um, it's not the same. I hesitate to compare it to that, but it's very clearly
wonderful
in
book.
that lineage. And then, if you want to look at other types of historical fiction with queer women and gender non-conforming characters, I really recommend this fantasy novel that's coming out this summer called She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. It is set in kind of an alternate history Ming Dynasty about this girl who becomes her brother, takes over his identity, and basically claws her way up to be the ruler of China. It's an epic fantasy. It is completely riveting. I mean, so much action and excitement. I just loved it.
That's great. Malinda, it's been a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you so much. I'm a huge fan, and I hope that many readers will pick up Last Night at the Telegraph Club and enjoy it as much as I did.
Thank you so much. It's been great talking to you.